Thank you, Graham, for the presentation, and thank you, Alte, for having me here today. Bon dia, buenos dias, good morning, everyone. Good morning to those of you who are at home. Thanks for being here after a long day yesterday, including the wonderful reception at the Cervantes. This is a CFR-related talk given to many of you who may be already CFR tired, especially if yesterday you went to Oslo, but you also visited Madrid or London or Vienna, where you attended some CFR presentations. You can still visit Paris after this session, where there's going to be another presentation on mediation. In fact, I've been able to trace 25 sessions focusing on a variety of CFR issues and aspects, including alignment, the topic in this session. But if you're here, I suppose that this is because you haven't had enough. So I'll try to preach to the converted and encourage them to continue their work and aim at whetting the appetite at those who are not yet converted but would like to get started. So, as you can see, the title reaches beyond testing and assessment into language education. And because of this, I will first take some steps back to the beginning, not to the 1970s, when it all started with the publication of the threshold level and the unit credit system by the Council of Europe, but to 2001 and the publication of the Blue Book. In my presentation, I'll outline where we stand and why we seem to not yet have got to using the CFR to the full in language education, and also in language assessment, if we think of language assessment beyond standardized tests. The CFR is actually everywhere, but paraphrasing Tineke Brumfout's words on Thursday, we might want to ask ourselves if we use it as we should. Then I will proceed to outline what aligning to the CFR entails and why we need to talk about language education in the context of ALTE, the Association of Language Testers in Europe. It is not only useful, but also wise to go back to the CFR 2001 and remind ourselves of the way it describes how educational systems need to give importance to being comprehensive, transparent, and coherent, and in their objectives and their methods, key elements that Nick Saville himself referred to when he talked about the mission of ALTE, the importance of coherence and transparency. The CFR argues for coherence as the harmonious relation among a number of elements or components: the identification of needs, the determination of objectives, the definition of content, the selection of creation of material, the establishment of teaching and learning programs, the teaching and learning methods employed, and evaluation, testing, and assessment. I'll go back to this near the end of my talk. I think that we could agree that this breakdown of components is very clear, an admirable list of statements, as Linda said yesterday. But I'm afraid that, as it happens with how we address diversity, we cannot claim that we have made too much progress along these lines in 20 years. Why has this been the case? I don't have an answer. We could argue that this is justified in the rather long list of criticisms of the CFR, some of them deserved, some of them maybe not deserved, or that we have been too focused on level labels, which have been adopted wildly and widely, with the labels not always being accurately displayed and the level descriptors not understood or even referred to. This is what we are used to seeing in the website and everywhere. But the truth is that the contents and recommendations of the CFR for language teaching, language learning, and language assessment have not reached the end users, language learners, language teachers, and many of other stakeholders involved in language education. I'd like to draw your attention to a diagram that Armin Berger, a researcher at the University of Vienna, presented At one of the first meetings organized by EALTA at Trinity College Dublin in 2018 to discuss the possible impact of the CFR companion volume, then in its provisional version. The CFR is in fact present at schools, but he argues that the impact has been weak, not strong as one might suppose and expect. It may be present at the macro level in curricula, but not so much in lesson plans. Its approach and recommendations are referred to, espoused, rather than applied in real fact. And when used, the focus is on concrete elements, on concrete descriptors at certain levels, certain sections of the CFR, or descriptors or descriptor scales. Following an event which took place in London in February 2020 to discuss and analyze the impact of the CFR companion volume, I carried out a survey with a colleague from the British Council Spain, Mark Levy. We wanted to know how far the CFR had really, in fact, had an impact in the classrooms in Spain, and how far we could say that the situation was not different from the situation that Armin Burgert had identified in his study. We analyzed curricula documentation at primary, secondary, and tertiary levels and canvassed over 200 teachers. And the work done by Armin Burger 10 years ago was confirmed. In fact, there's considerable knowledge of the CFR proficiency levels and scales in Spain, and there's little or no recognition of the action-oriented approach, especially at school level, or any of the other recommendations and suggested approaches that are listed and presented in the CFR. What we identified that, in fact, the CFR was inaccessible to many classroom teachers, the CFR and the CFR companion volume. And by inaccessible, it's not that they cannot download it from the web. Inaccessible means that they are sometimes overwhelmed by it, or they don't have the time to go and sit and read the CFR, although they've attended a number of webinars, seminars, meetings, etc. There's a minimal reference to the CFR and the CFR companion volume and the action-oriented approach in official curricula and documents. There's a lot of mentions of European levels and Council of Europe, but fewer mentions of the CFR itself or explanations of what it actually says. And we identified that there was a need for a greater focus on what the action-oriented approach meant in practice at all stages of teacher education. In fact, what triggered this study is that with the publication of the CFR companion volume, we all started talking about a change of paradigm. And we realized that, in fact, the paradigm that the 2001 version suggested had not yet changed, in fact. So, the Council of Europe knows about this, and as early as 2007, soon after the publication of the CFR and following a symposium in Strasbourg, a recommendation to member states on the use of the CFR was published. And we have the honor of having here one of the people who was most active in the drafting of this document, Waldemar Martiniuk. Hello, Waldemar. You suffered the writing of that. And the Council of Europe has worked to reverse the lack of proper impact. If you access the platform of resources, you'll see that. But I mean, only recently, another recommendation was published, again, to foster the use of the CFR and insisting on the importance of plurilingual and intercultural education for democratic culture. If you rush after this session, you can still go to the outer stand and find a copy of this recommendation. It's in French, but I was very happy to be able to pick it because reading this online is it's a bit challenging. So go and get it if you want to. There's still some left, I saw that a minute ago. If you access the platform of resources of the Council of Europe, or if you go to the European Center of Mother Languages in Graz webpage, you can find lots of materials, documents, projects, reports on how the CFR can and has been used in the classroom in 20 years to arrive at the publication of the updated new companion volume, which seems to have been thought to do the trick of, getting closer to classrooms. You can access the companion volume, which many of you have been referring to these days, in English, in Spanish, and in French. In the CFR companion volume, the focus on coherence and transparency has remained, as has the encouragement to select and adapt the scales and the descriptors to meet context needs. Of course, this is only normal because in the companion volume we have 35 new scales, which you have to add to the 54 existing scales already present in the 2001 version. So you have to pick and choose and decide what is most relevant in your context. The companion volume also provides very useful and relevant additions. More balanced descriptors by level, a wider spectrum is described. There's new scales covering aspects not covered in the CFR 2001, and to a certain extent, the companion volume does make up for what was identified as gaps in the CFR 2001. There's plurilingual scales that may be very useful in bilingual programs, CLIL programs, vocational purposes, tertiary education, airports, hospitals, etc. And the companion volume offers ways and opens up a way of assessing beyond the 4 skills. The 4 skills were sort of not in the CFR 2001. The CFR 2001 talks about language activities, not skills, but we've gone on talking about 4 skills, 4 skills, 4 skills. So we have a way out. In that respect, we are where we were, wiser, but the CFR companion volume still has some problems. Descriptors are long, and they retain inconsistent wording. The specific training is needed to implement the new scales. We had a workshop yesterday on mediation. We have another session today on mediation. It's been a very important issue in Spain since the publication of the companion volume. And also, different contexts and different countries have different perceptions on some of the scales. If we look at the plurilingual scales or the pluricultural scales in particular. So, let me see. Yeah, in that respect, we are where we were. We don't know yet if this is going to make it to the classroom, but at the same time, if we look at what the CFR 2001 said and what the companion volume says, we need to tackle the rather complex task of really using the CFR beyond language level labels and achieving coherence in our language education systems, addressing diversity in a transparent way and in a way that it is not, too costly. What issues are we facing when we talk about achieving coherence in our language education? Achieving context relevance and being useful. Matching the local to the global, going local. But at the same time, because we adapt the CFR to our context, we need to document how we've done it and why we've done it so that we are transparent and we know that other colleagues, other institutions know where we are and how we got there. And we need to do this in a user-friendliness way. We cannot ask schools or systems for too much effort or too much work if they cannot do that. So how do we do that? A lot has happened since the publication of the companion volume in terms of seminars, webinars, projects organized by the Council of Europe in Strasbourg, by the ECML, and by many other institutions, EALTA, UCALTA, ALTE, the British Council, publishers, etc. And there are a lot of resources available to get started in any CFR adoption, adaptation, alignment process. But I think that these 4 recent ones are a good illustration of what has been going in the past 5 years. I'll show them in order of publication. The first one is a book published by Multilingual Matters, which includes the presentations at the London 2020 meeting. Just before the pandemic, we managed to leave London just in time to get locked up at home. And this book was edited by David Little and myself, and it includes the presentations at that meeting that was jointly organized by EALTA, UCALTA, and the British Council. Then there's another document which is freely available on the website. It is so far available in English, but it will soon be published in Spanish by the Instituto Cervantes. And this is the book that a number of people got published following the discussions that we had at the London meeting and as a response to the demands that the profession was making, to some of the demands that the profession was making, with the main purpose of facilitating access and use of the CFR to all language education stakeholders with a brief, clear, and easy to follow document. There's another document which was published by the Council of Europe last June, June last year. It is a collection of small case studies, modest work, but very useful to consult. It is available on the internet, and it's called Enriching, I can't remember, I can't read, but you can access that from the website. And last but not least, there's this book that was also published as a follow-up to the 2020 meeting, edited by Michael Byram, Joe Shields, and I can't read the third person, thank you, because at that meeting, we kept discussing why, what's going on, what's happening, why haven't we been able to take the CFR to the classrooms, why the paradigm has not changed, what can we do to make things more accessible. And Joe Shields and Michael Byram thought that all the work that the Council of Europe has been doing since the 1970s has not really been fully consulted or appreciated or understood or even found in the website. So what they did was write a book that includes how the CFR, but also how the related documentation that has been published in the Council of Europe, but also related to the CFR, can contribute to quality and equity in education, which is one of the topics that this conference has also been addressing. So I'll now concentrate on the second part of the talk, and we'll talk about the alignment handbook. I'd like to make 3 points about this document. The first one is that this is not the revised manual for relating examinations to the CFR that was first published in 2003 and in its final version in 2009. It has a totally different scope. It's not a document that has been written for testers. It's a document that has been written for a wide variety of stakeholders. We may eventually have a revised manual, but we don't have it now. The novelty is also the authoring team, and you will see that there's 4 logos there, the logo of the British Council, UCALTA, EALTA, and ALTE. In another edition, I think that it is in alphabetical order, but it doesn't make any difference. And I'm happy to say hello to 2 of the colleagues who worked with me and with David Little and with Barry O'Sullivan on this book, and that's Nick Saville and Linda Taylor. Hello. We've had actually a good time, and we've done everything online. So we had nothing else to do during the pandemic and after the pandemic to meet at odd times and work on this. And then it is freely accessible from the websites of the 4 organizations. So you haven't yet downloaded it, go ahead and do. The handbook adopts what has been labeled as a comprehensive language system by Barry O'Sullivan, which argues for a close alignment of three elements which are often regarded as independent from one another. Barry O'Sullivan published this in 2020, but if you've been reading on pedagogy and language education, this is an idea that goes back to Tyler and curriculum development, etc. So everything needs to be linked. Assessment, curriculum, and delivery. And no matter, I mean, you can choose where you have the vert, the top. Curriculum can be at the top, but you could also have assessment at the top. Caroline Westbrook had made a presentation a couple of weeks ago, and she said that she thought that assessment could be at the top. So doesn't matter, as long as the three of them are linked, and they are linked to something in the center, which can be the CFR, or it can be something else. At a meeting I was attending, a teacher said, it's nice to see that, like the Tin Man, this triangle has a heart. Remember the Wizard of Oz? So it can be the CFR, it can be the curriculum, it can be any other standards. So, and why is it important to have a heart? Because it's the only way that you can achieve systemic coherence and transparency, establish a basis for a principled comparison across institutions, across levels, across teachers, across classrooms, etc. What are you doing? And monitoring for purposes of quality assurance. What does this entail? It may be bottom-up or top-down. You may want to relate an existing resource to the CFR, and there's a set of procedures there, or you may want to develop and document a new resource, curriculum, textbook, language test, on the basis of the CFR criteria. So these two possible approaches, which are contemplated in the handbook. The handbook, of course, follows the structure of the manual. There are five main steps: familiarization, specification, standardization, standard setting, and validation. And of course, our handbook draws on the manual. It is clear when you look at the diagrams, although in our diagram we made sure that it was clear the iterative nature of the alignment process. After familiarization, you do specification, but after specification, you may decide to go back to familiarization, the same with standardization, etc., etc. And now that I'm saying standardization, I forgot to mention that in the development of the handbook, it was not only the five of us who wrote everything. There's a lot of people, and some of them are in this room, who contributed bits and pieces, not bits and pieces, it sounds pejorative, who contributed sections of the handbook based on their experience. And then when we had the document, we circulated it to a wider circle of people who could give us their feedback and who contributed to making it what it is. So it's not the work of 5 people or 4 institutions. It's the work of quite a big number of people. The handbook also, although it replicates the structure of the manual, it takes into consideration 2 very different types of audience. An audience which may want a quick and neat approach to the CFR, or an audience that may want to engage in a proper alignment process and will need to work in depth on the different aspects. This is the structure of the handbook, no surprise. And what makes it different is that it has a lot of emphasis on how different users in different contexts have different needs, different available resources. And that has made us worry a lot throughout the development process. on impact and usefulness, on practicality, on brevity, on simplicity, and on exemplification. But I'll get to exemplification a bit later, because in fact, there's something that we need to improve on specification, on exemplification, sorry. Key features. The handbook, that's something else that worried us, and still worries us, because it looks as if people look at the companion volume and they don't have to look at the blue book. So what we do in the handbook is consider the 2001 and the 2020 as a single resource, and we point readers to other resources publicly available as well. There's a clear definition of each step, which can be completed individually, in a group, online, or face-to-face. There's different levels of detail to suit context, needs, and resources. There's graphs and figures to illustrate content. And there's summary forms that can help you keep track of what you're doing and contribute to an easier to make report at the end, and also to transparency. And then there's recommendations, because we found that the CFR and the manual have a feature that is very helpful, which is recommendations. If you are in this situation, ask yourself, blah, 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 blah. Be careful, make sure that you know what this involves, etc., which is something that we've missed in the companion volume. One example of this focus on different contexts is in familiarization, for example. We talk about generic familiarization and specific familiarization, depending if you're audience 1 or you're audience 2, or if you only want to have an idea of what the CFR is about. And this is what generic familiarization looks like. In one day, you read on the key aspects in the CFR, you become familiar with the descriptive scheme, you identify the salient features, you identify the relevant scales for you in your context, and you write a summary in Form 1, finished. Yeah, this looks easier than it is, but it is rather straightforward. Whereas if you're doing a specific familiarization, you may have to go through the steps for each language activity and for each of the competences identified in the companion volume. Recommendations. At the end of each chapter, we've written sort of something that at the beginning we called health warning, and then we were less sort of, patronizing and said notes for your own implementation. And that is, remember that you are the best judge of what it is and what is not possible or realistic in your specific context of operation. We strongly encourage you to tailor what you do to your specific context, looking after your resources and limitations. Avoid being tempted to do too much or more than is actually required for your purposes. Equally, avoid being tempted to underestimate what you need to do. Key questions for you to keep in mind at all times during the alignment process are, and then there's advice if you're working on your own, and there's some suggestions if you're a coordinator, which you have to add to the suggestions that are given to you if you're working on your own. Then we come to the last chapter, the chapter on validation, which provides you with a clear outline of what validation looks like and should look like these days, 21st century, but also gives guidelines for reporting, how to go about writing a report from purpose to structure, evidence collected, writing the report, making your claim, because after all these processes, we're going to make a claim, and then communicating your claim, disseminating your claim. And each of these steps is identified and glossed. And please note number 6, make the final argument or report available to the target stakeholder groups. But note, there may be a number of different reports for different groups. So you may just collect all the forms you've been completing together, and that's it, with an introduction. But if, of course, you've aligned an education system and you want international recognition, you may have to write a more substantial report. I'll show you now an example of one of the forms, which I don't expect you need to read, but this is what forms look like. They are, if you access the document on the website, there's a separate Word document with forms that are adaptable and customizable. So organize the forms in the best possible way. And these, again, have been inspired by the forms in the Manual for Relating Exams to the CFR 2001. And I'm coming near the end of my presentation. I think I've been going too fast, so there's going to be plenty of time for questions. I'd like to draw your attention to a paragraph that you can see at the beginning of the handbook. I'll give you some time to read it. There's a missing section in the handbook so far, and when we started writing that, we thought that we would have an appendix with scenarios on how this professional, in his or her context, had organized a course syllabus for speaking at B1, aligned to the CFR. But in the end, we decided that we might as well circulate the manual as it was and expect that those using it would want to share what they've done, their views on the usefulness of the handbook, and share it with the profession and share it with us, the editorial group, so that we can prepare a revised edition of the manual with an appendix where the different scenarios are described or the different case studies are described. So the plan is that what we're going to do is we're going to have an interim meeting in Luton at the University of Bedfordshire, Crella, on the 29th of September, and you will find this in your rucksack. So if you want to come, you're more than welcome. Registration will open in September, but you may also want to attend online because it's going to be a hybrid conference. And as you see in this brochure, the idea is that we'll start work before the event in putting together a template for the reports that we expect to be presented at an event, a bigger event, that will take place somewhere in Europe in the autumn of 2024. So those of you who are working on the CFR, go on and be ready to share. And those of you who have not yet started, you've got at least a year to get started and do something and share with us how useful you find the handbook, what you would change, what you would add, how you have used it, and why you've used it the way you have used it. And this is what I had to say to you today. I think I've gone too fast, but anyway, there's time for questions, and there's time for the next people to come. Thank you.